We're doing letter 21, which means that we're not doing letter 20. I'm not sure if we're finished with letter 20, but we dedicated 4 classes to it. And at least for the meantime, we're going to let it rest. And letter 21, like so many letters Tanya talks about tzedakah. As I explained it to you over and over again, the Alter Rebbe was a person who in his own life, and then later as a leader, saw tzedakah as a remedy for all kinds of challenges. Tzedakah heals materially, spiritually, and it connects us to God in a very special way. As we've discussed, we've been learning, Iggeres Hakodesh 21, we're 2/3 through the letters, and a good portion of those letters, maybe as many as half, have dealt with tzedakah. And the Alter Rebbe felt that because of the level of our souls today, the connection to God that used to be through Torah, and even the connection to God that used to be through tefillah, we're incapable of, but we know how to give. Tzedakah can allow us to connect to God. And as I explained it to you, I've told you the history. The Alter Rebbe preached what he practiced. Not he practiced what he preached. He preached what he practiced. As a young man, he literally gave tzedakah on a level of Mesiras Nefesh. And all his life, he lived in virtual poverty because he had a lot of money as a young man. And he gave it away officially as loans, but when he needed the money was gone. And as a Rebbe, he inspired his Hasidim this incredible priority into giving tzedakah. He was involved in a number of causes which forced him to be in the position of a solicitor, of a collector, and he frequently would write letters to encourage givers to give. And as I've told you a number of times, we have very little Hasidus in the Alter Rebbe's original hand. In other words, if you were to compare how much original writing we have of the Alter Rebbe in Halacha, in Nigla Torah, versus Kabbalah and Hasidus, there's very, very little Hasidus. Besides the Tanya, he wrote almost nothing. While the Shulchan Aruch, the entire Shulchan Aruch, Alter Rebbe has his own Shulchan Aruch. He wrote himself, as well as many Shalos HaTshuvos, halachic responsa. Hasidus of the Alter Rebbe is mostly recitation. He spoke, he made speeches, said Ma'amorim, and they were recorded by others. The letters were unique because they are mystical, they are Hasidus and Kabbalah, and the Alter Rebbe wrote them himself. That's why they're so special. And of course, the greatest cause of tzedakah in which the Alter Rebbe was involved was Tzidkas Eretz Yisrael, tzedakah for the Holy Land. He was the Gabbai, he was the treasurer for the fund that was meant to support the Yishuv, the community of Hasidim who had gone to settle in the Holy Land in 1778 approximately. And he solicited money from his Hasidim. Other Hasidic Rebbes also solicited money from their Hasidim, and all the money would be sent on to Israel through a special emissary. And usually when the Shadar, as he was called, the emissary, would make his rounds to raise the funds from the various Jewish communities, the Alter Rebbe would write a letter, which was a means of encouraging people. It was another original commentary on tzedakah, which and the Hasidim cherished very much. Getting Hasidus, which wasn't only said by the Alter Rebbe, but that was actually written by the Alter Rebbe, because they had so many oral talks of the Alter Rebbe, but they didn't have too many original, personally written discussions on Hasidus. So here is a letter on tzedakah. And in this letter, there's an interesting additional point that's not been made so much before. And it's actually in Shulchan Aruch. The Alter Rebbe is not inventing anything new. He's just enlightening it and developing the idea. And that is the idea that when it comes to tzedakah, the Chazal say, Hakol lefi raiv ha'maaseh. What's the most important thing in tzedakah? What's the single most important component of tzedakah? That the poor person gets it. Conversation over, right? When it comes to tzedakah, kavanah doesn't matter. Because the recipient has all the kavanah for you too. The person who receives it and buys breakfast, that's your kavanah. That's the most important thing. And of course, the more you give, or the more you lose and the poor person finds, the more tzedakah has been affected and the more reward one has, and so forth and so on. The key aspect of tzedakah is that the person receives it. And according to Jewish law, if you drop money in the street, there's actually one of the Tayyag mitzvahs. It's called shikha. It's one of the only mitzvahs in the Torah that you can only do by mistake. If you do it on purpose, it's not that mitzvah. If you forget a certain quantity of produce, wheat or grain in the field, it's not allowed to be beyond a certain size, because then it becomes a whole silo, a whole collection, and then it's not considered shikha. But if it's under a certain size, and you forget it in the field, so you're not supposed to go back and take it, and if a poor person picks it up, you get a special mitzvah, and it's really the only mitzvah in Torah that by design can only be done by accident. And from this we learn about tzedakah as a whole, that if you lose money and it's found by a poor person, you have given tzedakah, because the poor person doesn't care how you gave it to him.
Is it on a higher level if you so-called lose it and they find it so they're not embarrassed?
So there's other ways to affect that. It's always better to give with intent, but there's something called matan b'seisa, giving money in a way that the recipient, that's why we have a tzedakah pushka. That's the whole point of a charity box, that it doesn't embarrass the recipient, and this is one of the higher levels of tzedakah, that the giver doesn't know who he gave and the recipient doesn't know who received, and so forth. Here the Alter Rebbe has another idea, and that is that when it comes to tzedakah, the most important thing is the recipient receives it. The other most important thing is that you should give a lot. But in this letter, the Alter Rebbe focuses on another idea which is brought in Jewish law, which is you're supposed to give often. In other words, say you have $100 to give. There is something to be said to giving that $100 in 10 increments rather than giving it all at once. There's something more to be said to give that $100 in 100 increments rather than in one increment. Because the Chazal say, "Hakoil lefi roiv ha'maaseh." It is a part of the law and the idea of tzedakah to do the act a lot. In other words, even if the end is the same, the fact that you frequently give is considered a mitzvah. And you'll see soon the Rebbe brings a Rambam, and perhaps there's even a psychological argument to this effect. And the Alter Rebbe says like this. He says, listen, once a year I send around my emissary to make a collection for what's called Tzidkas Eretz Yisrael, Rav Meir Balanes. Once a year, the Alter Rebbe's representative would travel to the Hasidic part of Russia, which was the Alter Rebbe's territory. Every Hasidic Rebbe had a shadad, had a personal emissary, who would raise monies for this tzedakah. All the monies would be collected. It was all brought to one place, and then it would be sent on to Israel. So Alter Rebbe collected money from his followers, from his Hasidim, and once a year there was a special emissary who would travel around and visit the various communities and collect money. So the Alter Rebbe, and by the way, Alter Rebbe had a very interesting way of making a collection. He told each chassid how much to give. And they did whatever he asked. And sometimes it was quite difficult. And in fact, there is a story, this is an aside, there's a story with a chassid who went bankrupt. He went bankrupt because he was boycotted. He was boycotted because he had become a chassid. And the Alter Rebbe didn't know. And the Alter Rebbe always used to ask him for a certain amount of money each year. And the shliach came around and asked him for the same amount of money, and he didn't have it. So his wife pawned her leichter, her silver candelabra she used on Shabbos. She got the amount of money, and she said to her husband, I'm afraid that if we hold on to the money, we're going to find another use for it. Take it personally to the Alter Rebbe. What he didn't know was that she took some kind of a rag and she polished the coins. She made them glisten, shine. I don't know if they were copper coins or silver coins, but she made them very beautiful. And she said to her husband, let's not wait for the shaddad, let's not wait for the collector to come around, who knows what will happen, bring it. So he personally brought the money to the Alter Rebbe. And he walked into the Alter Rebbe's room and he gave him the money. He picked up the bag, and I want you to understand, the Alter Rebbe's Hasidim were very idealistic. It was beneath them to come to the Alter Rebbe and complain about their material condition, which is actually going to be what the substance of the next letter, next week, is going to be about. They would never tell the Alter Rebbe how they were doing materially. A person could be broke You came to the Alter Rebbe just for Ruchnius, just to learn how to serve God. And the Alter Rebbe opens the bag and takes a look at the coins, and he gets very excited, and he says to this chassid, where did these coins come from? The coins were beautiful. They were glistening, looked new. But the Alter Rebbe obviously felt that this wasn't just new coins, that there was some very special Mesiras Nefesh, some very special sacrifice in these coins. And he hesitated. And the Alter Rebbe squeezed out of him that he had gone bankrupt, and the Alter Rebbe didn't know. And that he had pawned, his wife had pawned her candelabra, and that she had sent him with the money to the Alter Rebbe so they shouldn't be tempted by having the money around and use it. And the Alter Rebbe got very, very excited. And he said that the kirat megemacht mit maras hatzevis, the water basin, was made, the kior in the Beis HaMikdash was made from the maras hatzevis, from the copper mirrors, that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want to take them because they were used for vanity. And Hashem said, this will create the Jewish nation. And the Alter Rebbe expressed his incredible excitement at the Mesiras Nefesh of a Jewish woman. And he gave them the greatest blessings in the world. He became very, very rich again, and he lived a very long life. In those days, him and his wife both lived till 110. In other words, this was Mesiras Nefesh, literally, to give away money you didn't have. And it wasn't a few dollars, it was a lot of money. And they had no intention of disclosing the Mesiras Nefesh. This was just the act of a chassid. The Rebbe makes a collection, he needs money, this is what you're expected to give. And they, Alter Rebbe was so excited by the Mesiras Nefesh. This is how the Alter Rebbe felt about the idea of giving tzedakah. So the Alter Rebbe says, I send around this collector once a year to raise funds. So you can put aside the amount and then give it to him when he arrives. I don't want you to do that. I want you to put money in the pushka every day. I want you to put money in the pushka every week. We call it a kuppah, right? In the Lashon HaShas and Chazal, it's called a shofar. The receptacles which they kept tzedakah was called a shofar. In the Mitzvahs and Chazal, there were 13 shofars in the Beis HaMikdash. You know why it's called a shofar? Think about what's the shape of a shofar. It's narrow on one end and wide on the other, so it goes in and doesn't come out. So that's what a pushka is, like what do they call it? You're not supposed to say a piggy bank, but a piggy bank, right? You put the money in, and then in order to get it out, you have to break it. So this was called a shofar. So Alter Rebbe said, I want you should give tzedakah every day, or at least every week, because although the end is the same, the collection is going to be identical. There is something to be said about giving tzedakah with regularity, and there is something to be said about giving tzedakah what he called bizrizut, with alacrity, not waiting, just doing it at the first possible opportunity. And I want to share with you a very interesting story, which is linked by the teachers of Hasidus, by the Mashpiyim, to this particular letter. The Alter Rebbe was a Talmud of the Holy Maggid. The Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, the founder of the Chabad movement, was a disciple of the Maggid of Mezrich, who was a disciple of the Holy Baal Shem Tov. The policy and the philosophy in those days was that Hasidus was not open season. In other words, it wasn't anybody who wished could come anytime they wished and join the Hasidic movement. In those days, you had to be embraced. In other words, the Baal Shem Tov was involved with thousands of simple people. But his inner circle of followers, he selected. One by one. You just come and join. You had to be accepted. Like registering in a school, you have to be accepted, recognized. And the Holy Maggid did the same thing. So it says in Sfarim that the Baal Shem Tov had 60 disciples, Shishim Giboidim, and the Holy Maggid had twice as many, 120. We don't know the names of all these people, but we know the names of a good portion of them. There's many books written on these people. But there were rejects. And I use that word perhaps a little bit in an oversimplified way. People who came to the Holy Maggid and the Holy Baal Shem Tov wanting to be part of this inner circle, and they were not allowed. Some of these people were unbelievably great. Some of the people the Maggid felt were unworthy of being at the center of his movement were actually very great people. Great scholars, some of them were Kabbalists and servants of God, but for whatever reasons the Maggid felt they weren't fit, they weren't worthy, whatever it is, they weren't allowed. So what would happen is people would come to the Baal Shem Tov, come to the Maggid, try to join the inner circle, the elite of the Hasidic movement at the time, and if the Baal Shem Tov accepted them, that was good. If the Baal Shem Tov didn't accept them, they would go home. If the Maggid would accept them, that was fine. If the Maggid didn't accept them, they would go home. But there were those who said, we're going to stick around anyway. Now, why stick around if you're not going to be accepted anyway? So they argued, we'll be Meshamish Talmidei HaMaggid. If we can't serve the Holy Master, we'll serve his disciples. They wanted to be around the holiness of these people and their service of God. It was a very, very intense environment and so forth. So they acquired the nickname Harubnikis. Now, I don't know much Russian, so I'm not sure what the word means, but it means something to the effect of people who warm ovens. Harubnikis, sounds right? Never heard the word. Okay. Harubnikis. They mean to say oven warmers. They would chop wood, and they would keep it in the shed, and they'd make the fire in the fall. They would also cut a herring for a fabreng, and they were cleaning the Beis Medrash. They did whatever needed to be done. But this allowed them to be around Talmidei HaMaggid. They could watch them daven, they could watch them learn, they could participate in their sichas chul, they could participate in their conversations. So they benefited a lot from Hasidus without actually being members of the movement. So the Alter Rebbe once wanted to explain how great these people were. He wanted to explain how these not accepted people into the Maggid's movement were. So he tells a story that he overheard an argument between three of these oven warmers. And they asked a question. The question was, why do we make such a big deal out of Avraham Avinu? Abraham, our father, such a big deal. What's the big deal? He took his son to the Hakodesh. He took his son to offer him up as a sacrifice. And the question they raised was, look at Jewish history. There have been innumerable, unfortunately, examples of martyrdom. And people went to Mesiras Nefesh HaKiddush Hashem. And, Avraham Avinu was by no means the only one. And why do you say, Hakodesh Yitzchak, we Rosh Hashanah, the most important day of the year, we say, Afresh Yitzchak is that Munachas Tachas HaMizbeach. We remember the ash of Yitzchak, and God should therefore forgive us no matter what, because our ancestors had great sacrifice. Many a Jew has sacrificed his life for Hashem. Many a Jew has sacrificed their children for Hashem. Why have I been such a big deal? So each one of these three men gave a different answer. One said Avraham was special because he was the first. He was Paisei Chasatzina. He opened up a new channel. In other words, before Avraham Avinu, no one had ever been a martyr for God on this level. And his being a martyr for God on this level created the possibility that martyrdom should follow. So he created the initiative, created the energy. That's what makes him special. Another one said, what makes Avraham Avinu special was that he did it with joy. He didn't just take his son to the Akedah since he was fulfilling a mitzvah. He did it with joy. Now that's pretty intense, if you think about it. And the third one said that what was special about Avraham Avinu was he did it b'zirizos. He did it with alacrity. He did it quickly. God didn't give him a timetable. God said, take your son and bring him on the Mizbeach. Avraham could have made a party. They could have gone on vacation. They could have traveled the world. They could have spent 6 months, with the last Torah. And he went the next morning, V'yashkem Avraham b'boker. So the Alter Rebbe said, he told the story. He described how these three young men argued about this. He says, I knew these people. Each one of them, what he said, he was holding by. It means the one who said that Avraham is special because he was the first would have been the first. The one who said that Avraham was special because he did it with joy would do the same thing with joy. And the one who said that Avraham was special because he did it with alacrity would have both done it with alacrity. And what's interesting, this is a story, that the Alter Rebbe in a number of places quotes them without saying their names. Here the Alter Rebbe makes reference to one of the three of them. He says, Avraham Avinu took his son to the Akedah, which is an unfathomable act of sacrifice. It's unimaginable, Mesiras Nefesh. So the Alter Rebbe says, so many people have gone on Mesiras Nefesh. Why do we make such a big deal of Avraham Avinu's Mesiras Nefesh when he doesn't have exclusive rights? There have been many others have been martyrs, people who were nowhere near the level of Avraham Avinu. They weren't prophets, they weren't scholars, they weren't holy, they were simple people. Says the Alter Rebbe, Avraham did it b'zirizos. He did it with alacrity. In other words, he didn't waste a second, an opportunity to do a mitzvah, like it says in Chazal. You have to watch the matzah, they shouldn't become chametz. So it says in Chazal, you're supposed to watch the matzah, it shouldn't become chometz. So the Chazal say, mitzvah shabola yoda al tachmitzena. When a mitzvah comes to your hand, don't let it sit. How does bread become chometz? If it sits around, don't postpone, don't delay, don't push off performing a mitzvah. So Avraham Avinu got the next morning with his zrizas to take his son to the arcade. Says the Alter Rebbe, tzedakah should be given the same way. And therefore, even though the collector is going to come by, for example, every year in the month of Tammuz, every year in the month of Elul, and you know when he's going to arrive, and you know more or less what you're going to have to give, don't do it that way, said the Alter Rebbe. From the day the shliach leaves the year before, put money in the shofar. Every day of the week, put money in tzedakah, because here you have, first of all, a koil lefirei v'maisa. Even though the end is the same, there is something about giving tzedakah more times, and there is something to be said about giving tzedakah with the zrizos, with alacrity. But then he goes on. So he says, first of all, hakodesh v'reva ma'isa. There is something to be said about giving it more often. Second of all, there is the idea of zrizos, of doing it with alacrity. And just to so to speak, enhance this, and to qualify this, he brings what we all know, that in general, when we learn Torah and we do mitzvahs, it's a shmira, it's a magen u'matzah. Yiddishkeit protects us. Tzedakah, more than any other mitzvah, is a shmira. And everybody needs a shmira. We all need to be protected from all kinds of nonsense, real and imaginary, material and spiritual. And for all of these reasons, the Alter Rebbe said it's in our best interest to hasten the giving of tzedakah as much as possible. And he brings the lashon, there's a concept of judgment every day. And because there's a concept of judgment every day, we should give tzedakah every day also. In Gemara, there's 3 opinions how often judgment takes place. One opinion is that it's once a year. One opinion is that it's every day. And another opinion is that it's every moment.
I think every second.
Right, so the question becomes, how could all those 3 opinions be real? So there's many different explanations of Sifrei Musa, that the basic judgment is done once a year. But then once you have money, you want to use it in an efficient way versus in an inefficient way. This is what the judgment can be. L'rega tibocheneinu. Hashem tests us every moment, and so forth and so on. And if we have to give tzedakah each day, giving tzedakah each day saves us from all kinds of narishkeit. Found the mice in the Gemara with Rabbi Akiva's daughter, that she was supposed to die the day of her wedding. And at her own wedding, she gave tzedakah. But in order to do it, she took off her hairpin and she stuck it into the wall and she killed the snake that was supposed to kill her. So she had arichas yamim. And this is just a curious little detail. Who did she marry, Akiva's daughter? She married Ben Azai. That marriage didn't last. There's different opinions in the Gemara if the marriage ever really happened. Because Ben Azai said, Nafshe chashki b'teira, I would like to study Teira. So it stands to reason that Akiva's daughter wasn't supposed to live. So she was married to a man who wasn't meant to be married. But she lived. She lived because of the tzedakah, so she married somebody else. But Ben Azai was takanavsha chashka b'teir. In any case, but then the Rebbe brings that Rambam. And before I tell you this Rambam, I want to give you a little bit of background. In other words, this letter, the second half of this letter, which is where we're holding, has a depth that I think is worthwhile for us to explore, to delve into, although you could skip it. You know, what I'm about to do, if you don't do it, you wouldn't even notice it. But if you do it adds incredible profundity to this letter. And to be sure, we've had earlier opportunities to explore this, but we're going to explore it with you one more time. What follows is, in effect, a discussion about philosophy versus mysticism. You know, most of the people here have been around Baruch Hashem for a period of time. So you know that very often in these conversations I bring up the difference between philosophy and mysticism in a lot of different ways. Chakira versus Kabbalah. The Alter Rebbe here presents you what amounts to a Rambam, who is a philosopher, versus Kabbalah, versus mysticism. And he gives us 2 insights into this idea of Hakodesh v'reva ma'isa, giving often, giving tzedakah a lot. And I want to give you the philosophical background. The philosophical background goes something like this. There is a question that says, Avodah tzorech gavoya question mark. Avodat tzorech gavoa with a question mark, which means, does God benefit from our service? Does it somehow... Avodah tzorech gavoa with a question mark. Gavoa means on high. Yeah. Does God benefit from the Torah mitzvah we do or not? Does it make a difference to him? Of course, there's a pasuk in Daniel which says no, but for every point you have a counterpoint. I mean, you look through the psuk of the Chazal, you'll find there's many. You'll find basis for any position you wish. But the way this argument comes down, it becomes an argument between the philosophers and the mystics. The philosophers say, of course not. Philosophers are logicians, logic. And logic argues that God is perfect, and we're certainly in no position to help him along. And therefore, philosophy takes the position that there is no benefit from Judaism and from creation and from man and from free will for God. It's only for us. That's why the philosophers often quote Teva Teva Heitev. Why did God create the world? Because he wants to be kind and he's being kind to us. To him it makes no difference at all. From the perspective of the philosophers, that Avodat Tzorech Gavoa, that Torah not Tzorech Gavoa, that God doesn't care. It makes no difference to God whether or not we do Torah mitzvahs. It's all for us. Taimei ha-mitzvahs, ta'amei ha-mitzvot, the reasons for mitzvahs, go into one of two basic categories. As Rambam writes it in the third section of the Moreh Nevuchim. Either it's about midot tovot, midas tovos in English, that mitzvahs improve our character by doing mitzvahs, especially which are ritualized and they're difficult for us to do. You know, PMP, practice makes perfect. When you do certain acts, those acts rub off on you and they make you into a better person. Like when you're sensitive even to an animal, you become a kinder human being. When you give a lot of tzedakah, when you give tzedakah often, you become a kinder human being, and so forth. Or tikkun hadeos, to straighten out our minds, to get our heads to think normal, to refine our intellectual equilibrium, if you will. So the philosophers who argue avodah is not tzedek avodah, God doesn't care. We cannot improve on God. We cannot help God. Nothing we do matters to God. It's only about us. So basically, and basically is a big word, either the mitzvahs are tikkun hamidus to refine our character, or tikkun hadeos to refine our ethos, our value systems, our priorities, our philosophical equilibrium. And mitzvahs that we perform have meaning, and the meaning affects us, and the effect is either in the area of refining our character, or it's in the area of improving our attitudes, our ethos. But that's about it. It makes no difference to God whatsoever. That's how philosophers view mitzvahs. Mystics disagree. Mitzvahs say there's a fact that mitzvahs do benefit God. But the mystics have a trick up their sleeve, which is familiar to you if you've been here. And that is that the mystics have a concept that's called godliness, elokus, as opposed to elokah, God. And like I said, I don't want to delve into this too elaborately. What we call Adam ha'elyon, the supernal man, or Atzilus. This is where mitzvahs come from, based on the idea that says, Ramach Pikudin, Ina Ramach Even, the Malka, the 248 positive commandments of the so-called limbs of the supernal man in whose image we were created. And if the mystics say, when we started to do mitzvahs, it matters on high, but on high doesn't mean to God himself, on high means to godliness. But we do more mitzvahs, to use Kabbalistic language, we expand the vessels of Atzilus, and we bring down more light of Ein Sof. So the philosophers say, God doesn't make any difference to God. The mystics say, no, it does. It does. When we do mitzvahs, we expand the vessels of Atzilus, more godliness is brought down. Now, parenthesis. Okay, I'm going to say something, but there's no comment. Okay? Chassidus would add something to the Kabbalah and argue it and explain it, and if we had time I would delve into it, but we don't have time because the Alter Rebbe doesn't say that here. Chassidus would actually disagree with Kabbalah and say Avodah Tzorech Gavoya means mitzvahs matter not only to godliness, but they matter to God himself. In mysticism, in Kabbalah, you'll say Avodah Tzorech Gavoya goes on alakus. And the reason mitzvahs matter to God, and again, I'm not going to give you a long insight, is because every one of us is a part of God. And because we're a part of God, we have the capacity on some level and in some way to touch God. So like I said, I'm giving you the radicalism, but you're going to have to struggle with it all week because we're not stopping for questions. Bracket over, okay? Back to the philosophers and the mystics. Hasidus is for another occasion. So the philosophers say mitzvahs are only to improve us. The mystics say that mitzvahs matter to God, or more precisely, they matter to godliness. Okay. Now back to tzedakah. We have just learned that even if you're going to give the same amount, it's preferred to give them in small denominations, in more increments, give more often, and do it sooner rather than later. Because of Zerizas, you want to do it with alacrity. Hakodesh, you want to do it frequently as every single day, as he writes over here. Tangentially, incidentally, one of the earliest ideas the Rebbe came up with when he became a Rebbe, when the Rebbe first became a Rebbe, he had very interesting ideas. One of them was called Keren Hashana. And the idea was that people should put money into a special fund that would give tzedakah for them every single day of the year. Say you forget to give tzedakah on a given day. If you join the movement of Keren Hashana, and you would give, let's say, a penny per day, which would be this year $3 and what would it be holding? $3.54, or you would give dimes, it would be $35.40, or you would give dollars, it would be $54, and so forth and so on. So they will give tzedakah for you every day of the year. So in other words, even if you miss, it's a great idea. Right? It's a very interesting concept to give tzedakah every single day. So Rambam talks about this. Rambam discusses this notion of Maisa that a person has to give tzedakah every single day. And he says why? Because it refines the character. The repeated acts of giving refine us more. When you give the same amount in fewer times, the effect is the same on the recipient, but not on the giver. And I'll tell you a nice little story as an aside. I have a neighbor who is, in my view, a holy man. His name is Rabbi Feder. He's a Bilzer Chassid. He knew the Helike Belzerev. He knew the Baal Belzer, the holy Rebbe of Belz, who passed away in 1957. Now, 1957 was a couple of weeks ago, if I haven't noticed yet. He could still see his Rebbe in front of him. I mean, that's how big a Rebbe he was, that's how big a Chassid he is. So, there is a custom by Belzer Hasidim, which is actually a Chernobyl Chassid, a custom. I just heard this recently from somebody, that once a week, darf man gehen Fayidens weg. In these Hasidic groups, the Rabbeim wanted everybody should be a collector. And whatever money you raise, you give to tzedakah. Once a week, these Hasidim, and you see this, if every Hasidic Shidduch come in raising money, they're often not raising it for themselves. There's a Rabbeim, certainly Rabbeim, the Satmar Rebbe here in America wanted this very much. Once a week, his Hasidim should go and raise funds. Now, it's not fun to go ask people for quarters, especially if you're well-to-do. But there was the idea of doing it yourself. Go around, ask people for money, and help people. So this Rabbi Feder comes around, and every week he comes around and asks people for money. And of course, it's a pleasure to give him. So he always tells me a story, whatever, from time to time. So one of the stories he told me was that in Belz was a big metropolis. There were hundreds and hundreds of people there all the time. And there were naturally many, many schnutters. That's how it works, solicitors. And it became very, very unpleasant. You couldn't make a step without being panhandled. So a decision was reached that they should have a place where all the collectors should come. They would be given a fixed fee and be sent on their way. Don't bother people. And the Helike Belzer, this is the father of the Friedrich Belzer. Yisachar David Bell said, no. He says, how are you going to teach your children how to give? Children learn how to give from giving. And they don't learn how to give from giving once. They learn how to give from giving repeatedly. Watching their parents give and giving themselves is a very, very important part of tzedakah. So therefore, you got to put up with the panhandling, because it's not just for them; it's for us also. Giving, the Gemara says that Rabbi Akiva was asked, if God loves poor people, I told this to you last week, I think, if God loves poor people, why doesn't He provide for them? And the answer is so that the rich people should be able to give. So the poor man says, you know what? Let me be rich, him be poor, and I'll support him. So the rich person has to keep on giving so that he can keep the Satan quiet. Because if he stops giving, as the expression is, the wheel of fortune can turn. So you have to give, and you have to give often. So the Rambam says, this is the explanation of Akol V'Reva Maisa. Every time a person gives, there's an exertion. It's hard. It's hard. Think about the psychology of it. We all know we have to give tzedakah. But nobody likes to part with money. You know, another part of the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe says, that parting with money is like sacrificing your life. You earned it with your sweat and blood. And you can purchase material, you can purchase food that can keep you alive. Why should you give it away? Give away a piece of life, even with your time, your energy, your life. It's hard to give. It's hard to give. And you make yourself give. Each time you make yourself give, it isn't only how much, it's the repeated act of making yourself give which refines the person. There's a psychological thing here too. It makes wonderful sense. It's very, very, very logical. If you're going to give $100 and you give it in 10 increments of 10 times you have to deal with the feelings of, why am I giving? This is good money. Why am I giving it away for no return? And the answer is because God said it's a mitzvah. And we're helping another human being and we're refining ourselves. So the Rambam, from the Rambam's perspective, and the Rambam as a philosopher, limited his comprehension of the effect of tzedakah. In other words, the meaning behind the mitzvah of tzedakah. To bettering, the person says, this is why you have to give early and often. Even if the amount is the same. Giving often is repeatedly doing acts that really require humbling of self and submission and squeezing yourself, and this is what makes us a finer and a better person. This is what the philosophers say. What about the mystics? The mystics have a whole other concept of tzedakah. And here the Alter Rebbe focuses in on the particular charity which he's talking of, which is charity support Eretz Yisrael. Tzidkas Eretz Yisrael, a charity to support the community of Jews living in the Holy Land. And he goes into a little bit of a mystical discussion that says the following. We know that there's something called Eretz HaChaim, the land of life, the earth, the area of life. The land of life is a reference to higher worlds, to Gan Eden, to spiritual realms. And we also know that Eretz HaTachtoina, the physical holy land, the land of Israel, is aligned, is parallel to the Eretz HaChaim Al-Yena, to the land of life which is on high. And when you invest in the physical Eretz Yisrael, you are much closer to an investment in the Eretz HaChaim Al-Yena, to the supernal Eretz Yisrael, than when you're investing in a cause, in a tzedakah, which is for chutz. Money that is sent to support causes in the Holy Land are special. It's always been this way. This is written, before Theodor Herzl was born, before Zionism. This is Torah. There's something very, very special about supporting Tzidkas Eretz Yisrael. He says, but there's another thing here. What is that other thing? The other thing goes like this. What is the mystical name for Eretz Halyena? What is the Kabbalistic allusion, Kabbalistic reference to this special land on high which corresponds to the physical land of Israel? And the answer is Shechina. Shechina in Hebrew. Special for you. Shechina. What does Shechina mean? Shechina is one of the many allusions to God, or godliness. And specifically, Shechina means the aspect of godliness which rests. That's what the word Mishkan, and Shechina means to rest. Right? What's the opposite of Mishkan? What's the opposite of Shechina? Mikdash, Hakodesh Baruch Hu. Right? The house of God is known by two names, Mishkan and Mikdash. Mishkan means a place of resting, and Mikdash means a sanctuary. But if you understand the nuance of the words, they're actually opposite. Because Mishkan and Shechina means the idea that godliness comes down. Mikdash and Kedusha, or HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is the notion of God being removed. The word Kedusha means separated. So, the Beis HaMikdash is a place where Kedusha meets Shechina, where godliness which is removed means godliness which is manifest. Kuchabrichu and Shechina. But the Holy Land, the land of Israel, and correspondingly the Eretz HaYoina corresponds to this concept of Shechina. And when it comes to Shechina, there's an interesting effect. And that is as follows. We are currently in exile, in Galut. Beis HaMikdash is destroyed. What happens when we find ourselves in exile, the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed and we're scattered all over the world? So it depends. The level called Kedusha, the level of holiness of Hakodesh Baruch Hu, Mikdash, it says in Zohar, Kuchabrichu Solak Le'elo Le'elo. The Kedusha ascends, it separates itself. The level of Shekhinah, Mishkan, goes into the Galus. It happens to be the Kriyas of today, the Chitas of today. Those are real Chitas. The Shekhinah is something called Galut HaShekhinah. That the Shekhinah, the level of God that is manifest, is exiled. It goes into the Galus with us. And what does it mean God is in exile? What kind of exile can God be in? The exile of God is his inability to express himself. God is here with us in Galus, and what does it mean he's in exile? We don't see him. It doesn't only pain us that we cannot see him, it, so to speak, pains him as well. Says the Alter Rebbe, when you put these things together, when you're giving money to support Eretz Yisrael down here, it mirrors supporting the Eretz Yisrael on high. What is the Eretz Yisrael on high? The level of Shekhinah which finds itself in Galus. So, mystically, when you give tzedakah, you are redeeming Hashem from exile. Kabbalistically, when you give tzedakah, you are redeeming the Shekhinah from its Galus. And he says, this is the meaning of the Chazal. Gedoyla tzedakah shamakerevas hagul. The Gemara says, tzedakah is great because it brings about the Geulah, the redemption. What's the connection? Simple. Every act of tzedakah, if it's supporting particularly, Yisrael is redeeming the Shekhinah from its Galus. It's not only redeeming us from exile, it's redeeming godliness from its exile. And therefore, when you give tzedakah, you're bringing closer the ultimate redemption when the Shekhinah is completely redeemed. Says the Alter Rebbe, according to Kabbalah, when a person gives tzedakah to support Eretz Yisrael, he's redeeming God from his exile. So the philosophers say, when you give tzedakah, and you give it early and often, you give it in small denominations, and in many increments, so you have the idea of zerizos, the haste in giving tzedakah, the alacrity in giving tzedakah. You also have the discipline in giving tzedakah. The philosopher tells you, Rambam tells you, that you're refining yourself, you're becoming a better person. The mystics tell you, you're redeeming God from his exile. And when you're redeeming God from his exile, it's not the money. It's, the famous story about this guy comes to heaven. And he stands at the gate and he wants to get in, and they say, okay, you have to pay. How much do I have to give you? $10 million. There's no trouble. They fill his checkbook. Writes a $10 million check, and he signs it. Hands it to the guy and says, no. Over here we take only receipts. Cash checks. Return checks we'll take. Not fresh checks. Already been given. ABG, that's what we'll take. He says, when you give tzedakah, you're redeeming the Eibusher from the Shekhinah. So he says, philosophy gives you its perspective. That by giving tzedakah, you're refining yourself. Mysticism gives its perspective that when you're giving tzedakah, you're, so to speak, redeeming the Shekhinah from Galus. And the Alter Rebbe says, but you want to be honest? They're really saying a very, very similar thing. In other words, although it seems like philosophy and mysticism are two worlds, and the philosophers have their approach, which has to do with refinement of me, and the mystics have their approach that somehow benefits God, says Rambam, they're really very, very, very similar. Why? Because just as the Shekhinah is in Galus, our nefesh is in Galus. Just like godliness is exiled, we're exiled. And when we give tzedakah, we're redeeming not only God from the exile, we're redeeming ourselves from the exile, which is exactly the same thing as the refinement of character. So he argues, although on the surface it appears that philosophers and mystics are giving very, very different kavanot, very different meanings behind the performance of the same mitzvah, if you distill it down, if you pay close attention, you discover they're saying very, very, very similar thing. And for all these reasons, the Alter Rebbe encourages people to give early and often. Because, first of all, tzedakah tatzel mimavas, tzedakah saves us from all kinds of not such pleasant things. Second of all, gedeilah tzedakah shemakareves hagul, tzedakah brings the Geulah quicker. Third of all, Hakodesh v'irei the Gemara says, as often it's not just how much we give, but how frequently we give. There's the element of zizas, with alacrity. It refines our character. It redeems God from Galus, and it redeems our own souls from Galus. In short, you want to do something that's going to help everybody, including yourself, give tzedakah. That's a message by the Alter Rebbe which was resounding He said it over and over and over and over again. The idea of giving tzedakah. And of course, everybody knows what the Gemara says. The Talmud says that you're not allowed to test God. Right? The Gemara says that there's a sin called iyud tefillah. Iyud tefillah means when you pray, you ask God for something, and you sit around and watch it happen. Okay, you ask Him to win the lottery. If you don't win the lottery, say, okay, I'm ready to prove it. Show me if you can do it. You're not allowed to do that. You ask God for something, and then you have to let Him give it to you. The one exception is tzedakah. When it comes to tzedakah, the Gemara says, "Bechonuni no bezois." Test me. There's a Gemara. Rabbi Yechim says. The Gemara says, if God wouldn't say it, we wouldn't be able to say it. But the pasuk says, "Loiva Hashem cheinen dal." When you give money to a poor person, you have given God alone. When you give money to a poor person, you've given God alone. Why? God has to provide for everybody. So if you give that person, you're providing for that person on behalf of God. So God is in debt to you when it comes to tzedakah. And just in context, we're holding Hakodesh. Hakodesh is a special time, a time of tshuva. And one of the aspects of tshuva is that you're giving extra tzedakah. And do it with joy.